Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next game is Game & Watch Punch-Out! The next game was the first game in another new series. This one was called the Microversus system, and there were 3 total games released in this series. The similarities between the name of this series and the recently successful arcade Versus system does not seem to be a coincidence. Similar to the Versus system arcade machines, these games had a big focus on the multiplayer aspect. While they always still included a versus CPU mode for Game Mode A, Game Mode B was a player versus player mode, and the systems themselves even had wired controllers to make it easier to play with others. In some ways, these systems harken back to Game & Watch Judge, which was the only previous Game & Watch system that featured a multiplayer mode. Unfortunately, as we'll soon see, I personally don't think the multiplayer components were designed all that well, and this series ended up being my least favorite of them all. Similar to the other Game & Watch series released around this time, I don't think these sold all that well either. One interesting thing of note about this one was that it actually released under 2 different names. In Japan, the game wasn't even originally intended to be a Punch-Out title, and it was instead just called Game & Watch Boxing. While the US branded it as a Punch-Out title, it seems that in many other places in the West it was still called Boxing and not Punch-Out at all. It appears that many, if not all countries in Europe still use the Japanese name, and through manuals and brochures, we can even see that there are versions of the game in English that were still called Boxing. Honestly, due to the existence of these English manuals, I'm not 100% convinced the title was only ever called Punch-Out in the US. Maybe it was originally called Boxing in the US, and they rebranded it at some point to try and cash in on the name recognition of the recently popular arcade title. I mentioned this during one of my streams, and thanks to the help of one of my viewers, we managed to track down the US copyright for the game, which seems to suggest that Nintendo of America was branding it as a Punch-Out title as far back as 1984, back when the game first released. The only real difference here is the name and unique box art made to match the style of the Punch-Out games. The game itself is no different, so I'm treating them as the same title for the sake of this challenge. Honestly, I don't even really consider this to be a Punch-Out game, despite the US branding it as one. While I still planned on playing the multiplayer mode, I started with the Versus CPU mode. One thing that immediately threw me off was that I'm actually the boxer on the right side, so make sure you keep that in mind while watching these clips. In this game, you can raise your arms up or down using the D-pad, which will cause your character to block in whatever direction you choose. When you punch, you will aim for either the face or the body, depending on where your hands are located. Finally, there is also a dodge move you can do if you press back on the D-pad. Now, there are some similarities you can draw between these controls and Punch-Out. Both allow you to block body and head blows, both allow you to swing either head or body blows, and both games even have a dodge mechanic. However, due to the perspective and multiplayer aspect, this game actually reminds me much more of another title we haven't seen yet, Urban Champion on the NES. Urban Champion also features your characters facing off from a side angle like this with near identical controls. These titles are so similar, and they even released in the same year. I can't help but wonder if these overlapping mechanics were no coincidence. Now, if you've played Urban Champion, you're probably aware of just how much worse of a game that one is than Punch-Out, and unfortunately, that's going to be true here too. The key thing that makes this game not work well is that since the game needs to work in multiplayer, there's no real patterns to learn like there is in Punch-Out. In particular, the game is designed in a way where you can't really dodge and perfectly punish anything, since doing so would make the multiplayer mode result in a stalemate. You can pretty easily react to punches and endlessly block them, but swinging a punch will put you at risk no matter what you do. What this ultimately boils down to then is a guessing game. You need to predict what move your opponent is going to do and respond in a way that gets them hit. While this sort of works against a human, against the CPU, it mostly just feels like either randomness or just figuring out what pattern is the most consistent. For me, I eventually found out that just throwing out as many punches as I could was the most effective way to beat the CPU. That's right, by the time I was done with Game Mode A, literally all I was doing was mashing the attack button, and that was basically it. So, when does this one actually end? In typical Game & Watch fashion, there is no ending in this one. The game endlessly keeps track of how many games you win, so I think just winning one game is enough. To win a match, you must either have more stamina points after 9 rounds or KO your opponent. I only ever KO'd my opponent, so I never totally understood how the rounds work. I think after enough time passes, a bell is rung by a guy that looks sort of like a duck. I'm probably just misreading the sprite here, but come on, what is this guy supposed to look like? Anyway, once the round ends, the boxes are reset to the middle. According to the manual, after this happens 9 times, the match will end. Like I said though, there is another way to win, and that is by knockout. To knock out your opponent, you must knock down your opponent when they have 0 stamina remaining. And how do you accomplish this? Making your opponent lose stamina is pretty straightforward. Every time you hit your opponent, and every time you knock down your opponent, they will lose stamina. Now, to knock down your opponent, you must continually deplete your opponent's energy bar and push them to the edge of the screen. Once they're at the edge, depleting their energy bar one last time will knock them down. And finally, to deplete the energy bar, you must just hit your opponent. Each time you hit your opponent, 1 bar of the energy bar is lost. When the energy bar is depleted and you push your opponent back, the energy bar recovers, but it recovers less bars every time you deplete it. If none of that made any sense to you, that's okay. I didn't totally get it at first either until I rewatched all my footage. All you really need to know is this: if you punch your opponent more than they punch you, you will win. My first run went a little rocky at first. The game feels pretty clunky, and I didn't really know what I was doing. However, by the end of this run, I already figured out how powerful just swinging punches over and over was. I KO'd the CPU with 32 stamina still remaining. While ultimately this was the only real goal to accomplish, I still decided to try to go for a few more rounds. All I really did during these rounds was mash the attack button. After my 3rd KO, I decided I was satisfied with this mode and I let the CPU win to see what happens. Once I was defeated, the game simply ended. I still wanted to try out Game Mode B, so I brought back Dr. Bop, my roommate, to play with me. Been a while since we've seen him, huh? This time around, I was the boxer on the left, and Dr. Bop was the boxer on the right. While this mode was a little better, since I actually had to read my opponent now, the game still felt pretty clunky and slow. Eventually, Dr. Bop tried employing my own strat of just throwing out punches, but this was easily countered by blocking and throwing out a punch before his next one came out. We went back and forth a bit, but I managed to squeeze out a victory with 34 stamina points still remaining. With that, Game & Watch Punch-Out was complete. On to the review. Yeesh, this is one of the ones I'd list as one of the worst I've played so far. The way the game is designed just doesn't feel very good to play. The punches are super slow, and a lot of the time you are just guessing when it comes to when you decide to throw out a punch. The versus CPU mode was especially bad, as I eventually realized that just mashing the attack button over and over was enough to win. Urban Champion is often regarded as one of Nintendo's worst on the NES, and frankly, this just feels like an even worse version of that game. I gave the game a 3 out of 10, tying Game & Watch Pinball with the lowest score I have given so far. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.